Cambridge Center for Greek Studies. Today, rather than introducing our Lewis Gibson Fellow myself, I've asked Dr. Liana Giannakopoulou, one of the pillars of the center, and from April 2026, chair of the Arts and Letters Committee at the British School of Athens, to introduce Dr. Fiona Andonakaki. So, Andonelaki, so sorry, yes, okay.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's talk. All of you who are here with us, and also all of you who joined online. I'm very pleased to introduce Fiona to all of you. Fiona is an early career and promising colleague in the field of modern Greek studies, but there's more than that brings us together. We are actually, I dare say, intellectual sisters or intellectual siblings, because we have both been very fortunate to study under the supervision of David Ricks, a most generous and inspiring mentor. Fiona is a postdoctoral researcher at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, and she's the principal investigator of the research project Reading Poetry Aloud, Education, Culture, and the Media in Greece, 1930 to 1960, which is funded by the Hellenic Foundation for Research and Innovation. She studied history and archaeology in Athens, and then she completed in 2018 her PhD. Her research focuses on modern Greek literature and performance, or in performance, and the relationship between literary modernism and popular culture. She has held research positions in Princeton, in Padova, at the University of Thessaly, and last but not least, she is a Lewis Gibson Fellow with us this term in Cambridge. She is also reviews co-editor for the Journal of Greek Media and Culture. So Fiona, we're looking forward to listen to what you have to say to us this evening. Welcome. The floor is yours.
I think they can hear me now. Okay, so thank you so much, Jana, for your kind introduction, and thank you all for attending this seminar tonight. My warm thanks also go to the directors of the Cambridge Center for Greek Studies for granting me this Lewis Gibson Fellowship that has enabled me to study this past month at the University of Library. And in fact, some of my first findings, I'm going to present them here today. Also, I would like to express my gratitude to Edward Allen of the English faculty for his most warm welcome and his very generous hospitality and encouragement during these past 2 years that we have been collaborating in these projects around literary modernism and the radio. And I would like to mention that an outcome of our last research project, which was based at the University of Padua, was this special issue edited by Edward Allen on radio in and around Greece, 1937, I think, to 1961, cultural politics and literary culture. So if you haven't done already, please check this very, I think, carefully and very interesting work. So let me just begin with my talk today. 2 weeks ago, on 19 February, the Deutsche Welle, Germany's international broadcasting network, has announced that it will discontinue its Greek language broadcast. Is everything okay, Jans? Okay. So, according to the press release, and I quote, "We especially regret the closing of the Greek service. For 60 years, it strengthened Greek-German relations and made the German perspective visible in Greece. Greece has long been a member of the European Union and is a stable democracy with a diverse media landscape, which is why Deutsche Welle must make cuts in this area. In a similar vein, nearly 20 years ago, in 2005, the BBC decided to close down its Greek section after 66 years of operation, and the then director of the World Service had claimed that the Greek service was no longer a priority for the BBC because Greek media enjoyed freedom and independence. In spite of recent scholarly interest in the study of transnational broadcasting, linked to the wider transnational turn in the humanities, it appears that, as Simon Potter has put it, and I quote, historians of international broadcasting have generally presented their subject in the context of empire, war, and the Cold War, focusing on international conflict and rivalry. Although the BBC World Service is most often examined as a key player in these 20th century radio wars, in-depth research into its individual foreign language services and their impact on their target audiences has been hitherto limited only to the German and the Italian services. Greek language international broadcasting has also attracted some attention in recent years, and yet its history has so far been examined in the context of wartime propaganda and political crisis. For example, the establishment of the BBC Greek section in 1939, immediately following the outbreak of the Second World War, has been studied in the light of Britain's wartime cultural policy. Again, the Greek output of the Deutsche Welle service has been discussed in the context of the Greek military junta of 1967-1974 and the broader anti-dictatorial movement in Germany. Now, shifting focus away from institutional history and foreign policy agendas and towards literary and media history, my research treats the BBC Greek language services as cultural hubs and as sites of creative experimentation. Therefore, rather than telling a story of cultural diplomacy and propaganda, this paper relates a story of literary interactions, of youth culture and mobility, of adaptation, remediation, and original radio writing. It focuses on the years immediately after the end of the Second World War, that is the late 40s to the early 50s, a period that coincided with the Greek Civil War, 1946-1949. When the Second World War was over, a collaboration between the BBC and the Greek National Radio, AIR, started, and thus the BBC Greek language broadcasts were replayed on the national frequency immediately after the Second World War. So that significantly expanded their audience. And listeners' letters arriving to London from various parts of Greece confirmed that in the early 60s, the phrase "I've heard it from London" has become synonymous with objective and reliable news. Now, the collection, let me just change. How can I do it? Ah, okay, the arrow. Okay, the collection of Greek language broadcast scripts stored in the BBC Written Archives Center remains, to my knowledge, largely unexplored. 5 boxes in particular, which are catalogued as the Cypriot scripts, date from 1947 to 1951, and they contain broadcasts which were transmitted as part of a special bulletin addressed to listeners in Cyprus. The scripts, these are over 150 scripts stored as Cypriot scripts, are classified into two main categories, the radio talks and the radio drama, the original radio plays. Most of these pieces are original, that is, they are written for the BBC. They survive in both typescript and handwritten form, most often without any indication of their authors. Now, the Cypriot Bulletin first went on air in September 1941 as part of the Greek Bulletin, of the Greek section transmissions. But then, 2 months later, in November 1941, the BBC Greek for Cyprus, as it was called, program, that was its official name, the Greek for Cyprus program, became independent of the Greek service and was moved to the Empire service at 200 Oxford Street. It would broadcast twice a week throughout the next decade until 1951, when the corporation halted its operation due to cost reasons. The Greek section, on the other hand, the official Greek section, remained at Bush House, which was the home of all the European services. This separation between the Greek for Cyprus and the official Greek section has been described as a blessing by George Angeloglu, who was the first program organizer of the Greek section. Because, and I quote, "In this way, the Greek section avoided getting embroiled in Cyprus issues." Responsible of these bi-weekly transmissions to Cyprus was Michalis Kakoyannis, the future film director, who at the time was only 20 years old and was studying law and also attending some acting classes at the Old Vic Theatre School. Unlike the Greek section, and here you can see Kakoyannis from an early magazine dating in 1942. Now, unlike the official Greek section, unlike the official Greek section, whose output was primarily centered around news and news bulletins, the Greek for Cyprus program was geared towards cultural and literary broadcast even from its launch. Perhaps due to the different listening conditions in Cyprus, because Cyprus was not invaded by the Axis forces and thus was in lesser need for news, objective news from London. During the Second World War, Kakoyannis became acquainted with other actors and producers, foreign English-speaking, working at the BBC, and also we find his name in English-speaking productions of the BBC as an actor. He lent his voice to radio plays of the home services. Now, whereas the official Greek section was staffed with full-time members, producers, who came from a background of journalism or the world of newspapers, the smaller and more flexible Greek for Cyprus service relied on freelance contributors. Nanos Valaoritis, besides Kakoyannis, Nanos Valaoritis, a young poet of the same age as Kakoyannis, was a regular contributor to the Cypriot program from 1946 to 1950, these 4 years, until he moved to the official Greek service in 1950. Andreas Kambas, another Greek young poet and prose writer who had left Civil War Greece to pursue studies in philosophy in Paris, also collaborated with the Cypriot program at around the same time. Close to this group was also Panos Vlachos, a painter who studied at this time set and costume design at the Old Vic School. Alexis Diamandopoulos, later to become a well-known scholar. At the time, he was studying also at Oxford, at the University of Oxford. And last but not least, Stavros Papastavrou, who was appointed lecturer of modern Greek studies at Cambridge in 1947. It thus appears that all regular contributors to the Cypriot service were of a young age, in their 20s or in their 30s, and had found themselves in wartime and early post-war Britain to study mainly arts and humanities. A letter of 1946 that Nanos Valaoritis had written from London to Stavros Papastavrou, who at the time, 1946, was in Oxford, indicates that the two of them, Valaoritis and Papastavrou, were very close friends. This letter was actually, I discovered it very recently among Papastavrous' papers here at the university library. It is then luckily that Valaoritis would have invited Papastavrou to give regular talks at the BBC Cypriot program. 11 of Papastavrous' manuscripts survive in handwritten form at the BBC Written Archives Centre. Although none of these bears the name or the signature of Papastavrou, there is one indication at the back of one of these manuscripts that links them together. It is a hasty note scribbled probably by Kakoyannis at the back of one of these manuscripts, and it reads, "Tonight we shall be broadcasting a talk by Mr. Stavros Papastavrou, a literary scholar and the lecturer of modern Greek at the University of Cambridge. It is entitled A Hero of Crete." It was actually this talk about the British archaeologist John Pendlebury, who was executed by the Germans during the Battle of Crete in 1941. The topics of Papastavrous' 11 talks, the 11 surviving talks, reveal the breadth of his interests. According to their titles, Papastavrous spoke on the Greek language question, but not from a historical perspective, but rather on how the language question was discussed during the Civil War and regarding the uses of the Katharevousa or purist idiom at schools during the Civil War. So it was an occasional and contemporary broadcast. The Society of Friends, this was a historical talk about this society that paved the way for the Greek War of Independence of 1821, the problem of modern art, the origins of modern Greek theater, news transmissions in ancient Rome, the predecessors of the United Nations, the spirit of Greek and Roman art, a quarrel over modernist poetry, which was about a discussion among British literary circles, and the Bradfield College Greek play, and the one that I mentioned earlier about John Pendlebury. I didn't read the Modern Greek Saga and Literature, which was actually a review on the then newly published volume, History of Modern Greek Literature by Dimaras, which was then released in 1948, the first volume, and 1949, the second volume. To these 11 talks, which I have found at the Written Archives Center, one can add an extra essay, which is devoted to Yannis Apostolakis, the renowned literary scholar and professor of modern Greek at the University of Thessaloniki. And this text is also among Papastavrous' personal papers at the university library. I believe that since it was written in 1947, it could be meant to be broadcast on the Cypriot program, but because we don't have a transmission date on the front page, we can tell that it was not aired. It was never aired, unlike the other hand manuscripts which bear the date of the transmission. Now, even when Papastavru transferred the listeners to a past historical period, whether that was Greek or Roman antiquity or 19th century Greece, his style never got dry or highly technical. Instead, his writing always maintained an unassuming and storytelling-like quality. Speaking, for example, of the origins of the modern Greek theater in the 19th century, he vividly recounted the social life and the entertainment habits of the newly founded Greek state. And I quote a small passage. There gathered all the distinguished members of the Society of Nafplion, and they danced. Their orchestra consisted of a single officer of the royal guard who would sing at the top of his lungs, clapping his hands to keep the beat. You see this kind of storytelling style of writing. Again, when Papastavru reviewed the staging of Aeschylus' Agamemnon at the Bradfield College, he first summarized the plot of the play in order to facilitate his audience to follow the commentary. And then he went on to read the phrase in modern Greek according to the Erasmian pronunciation. And after that, he made that comment. I hope that I gave you a rough idea of the way in which the ancient Greek of Agamemnon was spoken at Bradfield. To a Greek seer, it sounds strange, rather funny. However, you will agree with me that it is no small feat to learn by heart hundreds of verses in ancient Greek and to utter them on stage using necessary gestures and proper acting style. So these are small samples from his radio talks. Now, in addition to these annual student performances of Greek plays, at the same time, in the late 40s, the BBC's home services also regularly featured radio broadcasts, radio adaptations of ancient drama. As Amanda Wrigley observed in her study Greece on Air, Engagements with Ancient Greece on BBC Radio, and I quote from this study, the BBC Radio as a mass medium made the stories, histories, and ideas of ancient Greece practically accessible to a huge audience. Such productions in the late 40s included a panorama, as it was advertised, of Aristophanic comedy penned by Louis MacNeice, and also Frogs in Gilbert Murray's translation in 1947. So that was the general climate at the BBC home services. Now, similarly, in the second half of the 1940s, several of these BBC Greek for Cyprus scripts drew their inspiration also from the ancient world and revised or adapted ancient themes. Now, unlike the relevant third program productions, the airtime attributed to the Cypriot transmissions was only 15 minutes per transmission. Thus, this time did not allow for an extended radio play, but rather for a very brief radio sketch. Yet these time constraints did not preoccupy the authors of these works. Nanos Valaoritis, for instance, once wrote to George Seferis, and I quote, "You cannot imagine how much you can fit into a 15-minute broadcast slot," end of quote. As their titles suggest, the plays in question centered upon ancient Greek themes. And now I have singled out some of the original radio plays that I have found at the BBC archives, which are related to the world of ancient Greece. So we have the first one, which we cannot see, is Perseus, and it is written by Nanos Valaoritis. Although we don't have his name on the typescript, we have references in his correspondence with Seferis mentioning that I have written a play for the BBC called Perseus, so that we can identify with certainty. Meleagre or Althea, it has also the title Althea, Eurysthenes, The Clouds, which is adaptation from Aristophanes, an untitled play in which Aeschylus speaks. It is a fictional character of that play. Danae, which is written by Vasilis Kazantzis, a journalist who at the time was a staff member of the British Council and later continued working in publications and newspapers. Helen of Troy, Procrustes, Prometheus Freed, The Cyclops, also an adaptation from Euripides, and untitled, which has as its fictional characters Agamemnon and Shakespeare's Macbeth. Yes. None of these productions survives in audio form. Thus, the only way to reconstruct their content is through the surviving typescripts or manuscripts. Now, a common feature that all these plays share is this very popular at the time strategy of transferring the ancient myth and the ancient story to a contemporary setting. Let me just read, to give you an example, the opening lines of Vasilis Kazantzis' Danae, aired in July 1949. Kazantzis also penned other works for the Greek for Cyprus program that included mystery stories mostly, or short stories, but this was the only work of his that was based on an ancient myth. So this is the start of the play. You see that I have translated everything in English because, of course, the original is in Greek. And it starts with the announcer. Announcer. Tonight, you will hear a radio story by Vasilis Kazantzis, one of the rare cases that the announcer introduces the author of the play, titled Danae. It has, as you will realize, the classical myth as its background, but it mainly builds upon two motifs of our times, gold and the heart's love. And then we have music, and then the interesting thing is that the heart talks. The heart is a character. And says, lies, 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 lies. A wired web made of lies, pettiness, trickery, cheap words, backstabbing, and deceit. That's what strangles life joy. Then again, music, and then the heart continues. I am the voice of the human heart. I am the heart. So the story of Danae and her seduction by Zeus, who visited her in the form of a shower of gold, here is told through the voice of the human heart, which laments its lost innocence in the 20th century material culture of gold and all these things. It is this element, I think, the perspective of the narration, that distinguishes such radio adaptations of these familiar myths from their contemporaneous adaptations in other popular media, such as the cinema. What I mean is that through the radio, it is possible for the story to be told from the perspective of the heart. It is possible that the free rein might be given to fantasy. This element, the element of fantasy in this aspect, has been associated with radiophonic writing ever since the spread of this medium in the 1920s. For example, in this book, Gordon Lee's radio drama and How to Write It, which dates from 1926, the author advises aspirant radio writers to let their imagination run wild, because radio can create this undefined dramatic space that can ideally accommodate works of fantasy. So, what Lee tells his readers is that if writers wish to set their place in the heart of a buttercup, the imagination of the listener will provide the setting for it. This kind of imaginative vigor and creative freedom also marks the Cypriot scripts in question. As there are no spatial or other realistic conventions that the author of this broadcast has to follow, all kinds of boundaries, historical, cultural, geographical, are crossed in this place. So Agamemnon, as we saw before, is portrayed having a conversation with Macbeth, or Aeschylus, in this untitled play, which I argue it is written by Nanos Valaoritis, is having a conversation with the modern Greek painter, Theophilus, in this uncredited play of 1949. And I am reading this small part again. Aeschylus, theater seats are empty lately. My plays do not enjoy the popularity they once did. Could you paint a picture for me, he asks Theophilus. You will be well paid. Theophilus, what do you want me to depict? Aeschylus, put in the Danaids. Theophilus, how many shall I put? Aeschylus, 50. Theophilus, all right, boss, it's your call. And here we might have a little allusion to the fact that in Aeschylus, the suppliants, there is the chorus of the Danaids, which are actually 12, but they stand for these 50 women that are the Danaids. So it might have this kind of play with that there. Although the script, like the other scripts, is only dated but unsigned, I think that the reference to the Danaids points to Valaoritis, who since 1948, as we learned from his correspondence, had been working on a new interpretation of this myth, as he wrote to Seferis, and he had in that letter that, and I quote, John Lehman, the editor of the new writing, expressed an interest in seeing his adaptation of the Danaids. One of the few points of contact, says Valaoritis, I have with him, with Lehman, is our fondness of myths. So we can see how this theme of myths and the adaptation of the myths is a point of contact between the migrant young Greek writers at the time in post-war London with the British intellectuals and the British literary circles. Now, the humorous effect is more increased by this quotidian attitude of this mythic persona, but it reaches almost parody when references are made to contemporaneous popular culture. We have, for instance, a scene where Medea and Phaedra meet Aeschylus, and they reject his invitation to participate in his plays alongside Hercules, dreaming instead of a career in Hollywood. And we have Phaedra here. Hercules, who is he? We want at least Clark Gable or Cary Grant. Medea, we want roles in movies, not in wretched tragedies, in red satirical dramas. Come on, Phaedra, let's go to Hollywood. There is no future for us here. Theophilus, have they gone nuts? And an assistant to Aeschylus, Harry, master, they've brought a certain Cecile DeMille, an American film director, to shoot the scenes of the Battle of Salamis in your Persians. But they are rather unimpressed by the title of the play. They are thinking of changing it into The Red Skin of the East or A Mother's Suffering. This sort of critique to the uses of antiquity in mass culture should not lead us to assume that the young writers behind these broadcasts were against the film adaptations of these ancient myths. Soon after the broadcast of Perseus, Valaoritis wrote to Seferis that together with Kakoyannis, they had been working on a film scenario. And I quote from Valaoritis' letter, the topic will be contemporary, yet based on the Argonautic campaign and other myths. what would you say for some Seferis on the screen? And here, of course, the allusion is to Seferis' poem on the Argonauts that was part of his poetry collection, Mythhistorium. Valoritis then referred in the same letter to the increased demand in the late 40s for films based on myths and the colossal amount of money, as he says, that this enterprise involved. So they were asked to write film scenarios based on myths. Despite their certainly humorous and imaginative quality, the radio plays in question cannot stand, I believe, the test of time. So, had the original audio files been preserved, they would have been of definite interest to historians or radiophiles, but I think nothing beyond that, not the average listener. The question is, why then revisit these ephemeral scripts, which have fallen into oblivion immediately after their first and only broadcast? In my opinion, the answer is twofold. There is the micro level. The micro level that these scripts can shed light on the formative years of a broad array of Greek journalists, writers, and intellectuals, and thus enriching our understanding of their mature work. Stavros Papastavros' talks, for example, not only give us a rare insight into his scholarly interests and engaging writing style, but also situate him in the very heart of mid-20th century Anglo-Greek cultural interactions. Valaoritis' radio work, on the other hand, prefigures his mature avant-garde and surrealist poetics. The elements of fantasy, parody, this kind of generic hybridity, which is evident in these radio writings, is also a characteristic of his mature work. And in the case of Valaoritis in particular, this can be very enlightening because his London years have been often associated with a more high modernism in the style of Seferis and Eliot, whereas this radio work shows that the surrealist and avant-garde vein was there from these years, already from these years. Finally, for Kakoyannis, of course, the BBC years witnessed his first encounter with the world of ancient drama, and we all know that 15 years later, his film Electra will win the award of Best Cinematic Transposition at the Cannes Film Festival in 1962. Now, at a macro level, it appears that these programs of the BBC Cypriot service offer a counterexample to the view that foreign language broadcasting was a mere tool of cultural propaganda. As we saw, the radio talks of Papastavru, from their topics, rarely centered on themes of strictly British interest. Rather, even when British-related themes entered his topics, as was the talk on Pendlebury or the Bradfield College play, they would also touch upon themes of a Greek interest somehow, of an Anglo-Greek connection and relation. It seems that the BBC offered, of course, unwittingly, I believe, offered to these young Greeks a channel through which to disseminate their work, and not only their work, but through their talks, their ideas on the modern Greek literary tradition and the contemporary Greek literature. And this is all the more important because at the same time, in the post-war years, the Greek state radio, the National Radio Foundation, did not promote contemporary voices at all, but rather maintained a very strict classics-only policy. So until the late 50s, it broadcasted only the work of deceased authors. So this, if we put it in that context, is very refreshing for Greek radio culture in general, and it modernizes Greek radio culture. So we see that, when Valaoritis, it's an example, but it's, I think, characteristic. When he invited his fellow poet, Odysseus Elitis, who was at the time in Paris, to come to London and give some talks through the BBC, Valoritis added in that letter to Elitis, and I quote, "We hold in our hands a dynamic weapon, a broadcast that the whole of Greece is listening to." And this is a hint of its influence, of its potential audience. Now, in closing, as I have extended my research to the early 50s, and I have not yet proceeded to the mid 50s and the later 50s, it remains to be seen, and this would be an interesting hypothesis and a thing to research further, to what extent the BBC lost its significance as a cultural hub for migrant Greek writers after the mid-50s, when British and Greek strategic interests clashed, of course, over the mounting Cyprus crisis at the time. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jana. That was also, I mean, very interesting, but also very nicely presented, and I was able to follow everything, which is not usually the case. So thank you again. Any questions? And we may have from online as well, so we may quickly check. Yes, please. Yes, Ned. Go on, yeah, go on.
It's useful research. It's really exciting. It's so lovely to see this archival material being brought to light. The connections you make is just wonderful. Question about both tonally and in terms of the kind of parody and fantasy you're noticing in that play. I take your points about them kind of dating oddly. They do seem of their time, and it does remind me a lot of McNeese's sort of post-war. So, I mean, the question is completely. Did they know one another and time together?
Yes, we don't have. That is one problem with the research, is that these key actors of these events did not narrate their time at the BBC later. I don't know why is that. Perhaps they didn't thought that it was very significant. You know, there was a recent documentary about Nanos Valaoritis, for which the filming took 10 years. And it was 3 hours long. And I went to the director and I asked him, did he tell you anything about the words radio or BBC? And there was nothing. So the actors themselves have not offered us testimonies about their acquaintance at the time. But we know from other sources, from correspondences, that, of course, Valaoritis and Seferis knew McNeice. And they had some contact, and McNeice was the first to present Greek poetry on the third program as well. So we have this broadcast, which is actually survives in audio form from 1959, where Seferis reads, and it is, and he starts by saying, "I'm here only because Louis McNeice asked me to come." So 59, yes. But it was almost 10 years later than these late 40s programs. I'm sure, though, the fact that Aeschylus appears as a character in these plays, I think this kind of freedom was perhaps borrowed from what the British, their British counterparts were doing. Like McNeice, we know that in this panorama of Aristophanic comedy, had Aristophanes speaking with his characters. And the voice of Aristophanes was interpreted on air by Dylan Thomas. Yes. So yes, of course, they had connections. Go on.
I wanted to ask about the Cyprus service, because all the people you've talked about are Greeks. Where are the Cypriots?
Kakoyannis.
Apart from
Kakoyannis.
yes, but so was it really run by Greeks? And there were no Cypriots other than Kakoyannis who would bear part?
Yes, it appears to be the case. It appears that Kakoyannis was enjoying full control of the service. So because Valerides was his friend, and Cambas, they were friends. One kind of told the other to come and collaborate because they needed the money. I think it were financial reasons there, because they get paid for each broadcast. Either they were writing or they were, participating as actors. So it was kind of community thing. And we don't have another Cypriot except from Kakoyannis and his assistant, Beba Kliridis, which of course you know, because Kazantzakis had asked her to translate his Zorba the Greek. So we had these two Cypriots, Kakoyannis and Kliridis, his assistant, and all the others were Greeks. There is a question from Tassos Papakostas, but Jana, go first and I will answer.
Well, first of all, congratulations. That was totally new to me. This is a field that, sounds fascinating from what I can see from your work, Fiona. So thank you very much. I couldn't help thinking that, because as you know, I'm interested in myth, that the way that myth is used in what you showed us is totally different from myth used in Greek literature in Greece at the time. So two different uses of myth. It seems to me that these people were more playful and more free of the very kind of national or ideological constraints that authors felt in Greece, right? And also that they completely ignore the war context? The war. I mean, these are in the middle of the war.
Nice question.
So is this like Personal Landscapes, the periodical? Like, are they completely turning their back to the world, to what's happening?
Could this be actually ideological? Not, I mean, you're showing that there's no propaganda here, but if they're doing this sort of stuff, and meanwhile you've got a civil war, could it be like some sort of sidetracking?
Thank you for these questions. Again, you see the difference between the Greek section, which has every broadcast controlled, because I didn't mention that, I will say that now. When I researched through the files of the Greek section, there were many broadcasts translated in English, which indicates that they were going through controls. So everything was controlled, everything was censored. You couldn't say anything you liked. Papastavru is an interesting case here in the context of the Civil War, because he makes comments like, no, we don't have to use the purist idiom in Greek schools in 1948. So he makes these subtle comments that denote a stance, an opposing stance to what was happening in Greece. The Greek service, on the other hand, was 100, the Greek, not the Cypriot, 100% on the Greek governmental line. Like we have the guerrillas, and it was 100% the governmental line. But the Cypriot service, I think, through humor and through these sketches, they have, let's say, a family, a very funny family that goes on a deserted island in Caria. And they have this comment that, who are all these people that are here now, the exiles of the Civil War? So they have all these very subtle allusions there, but you have to be very careful. On the open, they don't say anything about the war. It's like we are in a different era. We are in the late 50s, let's say. This could be played in the late 50s. But if you search, you find some indications in the talks or in the plays.
Thank you. Thank you, Fiona. Maybe we can look at that.
And the last thing I want to say about the different treatments of the myth is that you don't have to go to Greece. Valerides at the time is translating Seferis's myth historima. And at the time, he is publishing his first poetry collection, The Punishment of the Magi, or something like that, which has a poem called Andromeda, which is in the Seferis tradition, in a way echoing Seferis's idiom. And at the same time, he writes this very subversive and very playful thing. So you can have both. Of course, they were enjoying some kind of freedom. That's why what I understand from these scripts, that they were not very carefully controlled.
Thank you, Fiona. So, Tassos Papakostas, do you want to read the question?
Thanks, Fiona. Fascinating. Thank you, Tassos, for listening. Do we know anything about the receiving end? Good question. The receiving end, the audience, how these broadcasts were received, indeed, how many people may have tuned in? Was there ever any contact between audience and broadcast in the form of letters? Of course, Tassos, thank you very much for your question. We don't know much. The BBC, unlike the Greek radio, initiated audience research much earlier. So from a point on, we know some facts regarding the Greek section. It had enormous appeal during the war due to the Nazi-controlled state radio in Greece. They all tuned into London, and the London programs capitalized on this fame they had, this power they had during the war. So George Angelou, who was the first program director, calls these years the golden years of the Greek section, immediately after the war and until the mid-50s, when we had this mounting Cyprus crisis. Now, when that happens, it changes completely the landscape, because all channels between BBC and the Greek state radio are cut. So listeners in Greece cannot so easily listen to the BBC broadcast. In terms of actual letters, although we are very aware that this was a very typical and usual practice, and we have photographs from assistants and secretaries opening letters just to show that we have feedback from Greece and very positive feedback. When I went at the BBC Written Archive Center, I only found one letter with the phrase "Long live the Allies," and it has the two flags, the Greek and the Britain, and it thanked the BBC broadcasters in 1941. I think this letter was dated for their coverage, their news coverage, and their reliable news. But other than that, to my knowledge, as far as the material that I went through is concerned, there are no surviving audience listeners' letters.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Tassos.
Let's give in one final warm applause to Dr. Many thanks to our online audience for attending. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Well done.